Hello there. I'm Brad Finkbeiner. I'm a teacher here at Providence Classical School. And about a month or two ago, I did a short piece on the website about the social dilemma. And the point of that was to suggest that the crisis that's occurring in our country right now is in large part due to a lack of confidence in truth, the ability to find truth, even the definition of it, what it is. And so what I thought we could do today is continue that theme and explore the concept of truth itself. And so to that end, I have a PowerPoint here. It's entitled, "What is Truth?" That's a quote from Pontius Pilate. I think it's a timely quote because there are a lot of people who have that sentiment today. There are a lot of reasons for why people have become confused about the nature of truth or lost confidence in our ability to find it. I can't get into all of those, but there's one in particular that I want to focus on today. I'm going to use a really kind of gnarly word for this. It's subjectivization of truth. And to illustrate what this means, I have a quote here. It's really a slogan. If you believe it, it's true for you. But that doesn't make it true for me. Now, not too long ago in Western intellectual history, this statement would have seemed nonsensical. They literally would have dismissed it as illogical. It doesn't really make sense. And yet, we use this sort of slogan regularly today. Notice the first part. If you believe it, it's true for you. Okay, so there are two concepts here that we need to analyze, belief and truth. So the first thing we're going to do is talk just briefly about the nature of belief. Here you see a common plaque, believe. Now, the verb believe obviously is missing an object here. This is why some people kind of poke fun at this, right? It doesn't tell you what to believe. It's just an empty command. Does it mean believe that Adolf Hitler was a good guy? Of course not. So what does it mean, right? What are we supposed to believe? It's begging for an object. So this leads to the first principle. The definition of belief that we use here in our curriculum is to assent to a proposition, to agree with it, to judge that it's true. So look at these two sentences here. The first one, I believe that Caesar crossed the Rubicon River. The second, I believe that racial discrimination is wrong. In both sentences, you see the first part being I believe. That's a reference to the person's assent. They're assenting. And then you see the underlined part, which is the proposition. That is the object, the direct object of their belief. Principle 2 develops this idea. Principle 2 is that there's a difference then between the subjective act of believing or assenting and the objective truth of the proposition believed. So look at this next sentence. I believe that George Washington chopped down a cherry tree. Here again in the orange you see I believe. That's focusing on the person, the subject, who is assenting. And then in the purple, you see the proposition to which they're assenting. And the diagram here helps you to see that difference. Now, what we need to learn to do as Christians engaging this culture where we've subjectivized truth is to help people to see the difference. What we need to be focusing on is not the fact that I believe or you disbelieve. It's on the proposition. That's what we have to turn our attention to. So principle 3, to make this clear, why it's so important to turn our attention to the proposition, notice that it's possible to believe a false proposition or to disbelieve a true one. Consider the first example. Some Europeans believed that Columbus reached Japan. Now, the underlying proposition there is in fact false. But it's true that they believed that it was true, right? So they misbelieved. The second one, Some Americans did not believe that men walked on the moon. Now, the underlying proposition here is true, but there were some Americans who dissented from it. They did not believe it. So this leads to principle 4, that what makes a proposition true or false is not whether one believes it or disbelieves it. It's whether that proposition corresponds to reality. This is called the correspondence theory of truth, and it is a classical principle that goes all the way back to Aristotle, and that has been maintained in Western culture until very, very recently. What does it mean? Well, you'll see here a jar. It's labeled cookies. Now, we don't really know what's in the jar. Maybe there are cookies, maybe it's empty, maybe there are crackers, we don't know. Call that reality. So the reality is whatever is in that jar. Now, to the left, you see a man who believes that there are cookies in the jar. Okay? So the proposition he believes is there are cookies in the jar. Now, the only real question here is, as the arrow shows you, whether that proposition corresponds to reality. Now, think about this. If it corresponds, if it says that the world is the way the world is, that proposition is true. If it doesn't, it's false, right? But what makes the proposition true is not our believing it, it's reality. It's what's outside of our minds. And the proposition becomes then the truth bearer. Reality is the truth maker. The proposition is the truth bearer. It's either true or it's false according to whether it corresponds to that objective fact, that reality. Moving on now to proposition, or principle 5 rather, I want to spend a little bit of time helping you to understand what happens when we preface our statements with I believe or I don't believe. Putting I believe in front of the proposition changes the meaning of the proposition, and it distracts us from the real issue in a discussion or a debate. Think about claim 1 here. Jesus rose from the dead. Claim 2, he believes that Jesus rose from the dead. These sound like they're kind of the same proposition. They're both referencing Jesus, they're both referencing the resurrection. But if you think carefully about it, they're actually two completely different propositions. The first one is about Jesus, and the second is not at all. It's possible then, and this is crucial to appreciate, it's possible for two to be true and one to be false, right? It's possible that one could believe Jesus rose from the dead, and yet it be false that Jesus rose from the dead. It's also possible for one to be true and two to be false. It's possible that Jesus actually rose from the dead, and yet one not believe that. Now look at how this affects debate. If you look to the bottom left there, you see two men at a podium. One person says, I believe Jesus rose. The other person says, I don't believe Jesus rose. Now, you might initially think they're actually having a debate, but in reality, they're both doing autobiography. The first guy is saying, I, say Mr. Jones, believe that Jesus rose. The second guy, say Mr. Smith, is saying, I, Mr. Smith, don't believe Jesus rose. It's very much as if one of them is saying, I like chocolate, I like vanilla, right? They're not even talking about the same subject anymore. They're talking about themselves. Whereas if you look to the right, you see that one guy says Jesus rose, the other says Jesus did not rise. That's what we call clash. They're contradicting each other. They can't both be correct. But if you look back to the left side, they both can be correct and probably are, right? If you believe Jesus rose and you say you believe it, then what you say is true. But all you're really saying is something about yourself. It's autobiography. It's like saying I'm 6 foot tall or something. The other guy probably doesn't believe, and so he's saying something true about himself. But there's no clash. There's no contradiction. Now let's apply this to actual real-life debates. Principle 6 here. A proposition is true or false regardless, in capital letters there to emphasize, regardless of who believes it, regardless of how many people believe it, and regardless of how firmly we believe it. So here in this image, you see pro-choice advocates, pro-life advocates. Now, as a piece of just straight sociology, I would say, well, there's some people in that crowd who believe one proposition. There are people in the other part of the crowd who disbelieve it. Now, knowing that some people believe and others disbelieve is not in any way, shape, or form relevant to the real question. The question is, what is inside the womb? What is happening inside the woman's womb? Is that a human being? If so, does this human being have rights, God-given rights? Those questions are about something objective outside of us, about what's happening outside of us. And those questions have a correct answer. Either the unborn is a person or a human with rights, innocent, in need of protection, or not. And we can have that debate. We need to have that debate. It's crucially important that we do. But notice that however many people happen to believe one side or the other, however intensely their beliefs are, it doesn't matter because it doesn't affect the reality of what's happening inside the womb. Now, let's go back to the slogan here. If you believe it, it's true for you. But that doesn't make it true for me. By this point, you can understand why this would never have made sense to previous generations. So consider problem number one. If you were to take this slogan literally, it would make it impossible to have false beliefs. Think about it. If believing a proposition made it true, then whatever one believes would be true, by definition, in which case no one could ever be corrected. I think this is actually part of the motivation for using this slogan, so that people can kind of get off the hook and not be challenged and refuted. Problem two, what if I believe that one of my beliefs, say about science, is false? This belief about science would then be both true and false. It would be true because I believe it, and if whatever I believe is true, then that would follow. But if I believe it's false, then it would be false because I believe it's false. Well, that's a contradiction. That doesn't make any sense. Problem three, and this is really the fundamental issue. This slogan would make reality, there's that word, conform to our minds, rather than make our minds conform to reality. This is why, classically, we believed in what's called the correspondence theory of truth, that thought must conform to thing, that our propositions, our statements must conform to reality, not the other way around. Now watch what happens, though, if you don't take this seriously. If it's the case that whatever you believe is true, then if I believe Joe murdered his wife, Joe would be a murderer by definition. And if you don't believe it, then he's not a murderer. And if we have these contrary beliefs at the same time, then he's both a murderer and a non-murderer at the same time. Well, that's nonsense. This leads us to the final point. I want to wrap this up here. What matters most in our current cultural discussion and debate is not whether so-and-so believes such and such, or how many people believe it. What matters is, are the propositions to which we assent true or false? And to answer that, we have to go and look at the world. We have to go and consider evidence. We have to be factually oriented. Right now, there's a lot of talk about being on the wrong side of history, say with respect to issues of gender or sexuality. If you think about what that really means, though, it's sort of saying, or it seems to me to be suggesting, that people as a whole in society are changing their beliefs, changing their assent. Whereas in the past we assented to one set of propositions, traditionally, we're now moving as a society into changing our assent towards a different set of propositions. And the idea is, well, don't you want to be with the new group and their new assent, their new belief? Well, yeah, if they're right, but no, if they're not. The issue is not who's believing what or how many people are believing it or how passionately they're believing it. We must fundamentally get back to the correspondence theory of truth, that truth is correspondence between our claims, and the world in which we live, the world we occupy, the world fundamentally that God has created, in which He alone gets to define for us. So that would lead then to another episode, which would be about where do we find truth? And as Christians, we have an answer to that one as well. But until we can get clear on what truth is, we can't really get into that second conversation, it seems to me. All right, well, thanks for giving me your attention. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to receive emails and interact with you that way. So thanks so much. Bye-bye.